some of you maybe know the origin of this class. I received a couple of questions earlier in the year about things that happened in the book of Acts, and both of them related to things that happened in the temple. And so in studying to answer those two questions, I thought I knew a lot about the temple till I started digging in to answers for the two questions which I received. And so I kept studying after I answered the two questions, and now I have to go back and correct one of the answers because I now know more than I did when I answered the question, but that's usually the case. And so I started looking in detail about the temple, and of course we're not practicing the rituals of the law of Moses and what went on there, but so much of the New Testament involves things that happened in the temple, both in the life of Christ, the Gospels, and also in the book of Acts. And so I thought it'd be profitable if anybody wanted to come, and obviously somebody did, you did. And so we're going to start tonight. If I have to give this this first lesson a title, I guess I'd call it The Stones of the Temple. You can't really appreciate the temple that Herod built on the top of Mount Moriah until you understand what was necessary in order to build it on the top of Mount Moriah, and that is the foundation. But if you don't know anything about Herod the Great, just a few words. Most people know he was not a Jew. He was an Idumean. That means he was a descendant of Esau. And early on in his career, somehow he made friends with Mark Antony of Antony and Cleopatra fame. And Mark Antony kind of pushed him on up the ladder as time went by. And so, at the ripe old age of 25, he was appointed a procurator of Galilee. And following a few years later, Mark Antony gave him a tetrarchy, that is a rule of an area of 4, which doesn't always mean it was literally 4, but it was a title, whether it was actually 4 provinces or whatever. But he got a tetrarchy with the aid of Mark Antony, and then Mark Antony promoted him to the Roman Senate to make him king of the whole area, king of Judea, which of course eventually he became. Now, the Emperor Augustus enlarged his authority, but after a few years, in 37 BC, he was crowned king of Judea, and by Caesar, and the records said it was a very ostentatious, magnificent presentation. And this, of course, would characterize Herod's life and the life of his descendants, the so-called Herodian dynasty, the love of splendor and magnifying yourself. And of course, one way to do that was to build tremendous building projects such as the temple. But Herod just doesn't, we associate his name with the temple in Jerusalem, but he built pagan temples. And if you are following the archaeology that's going on right now in the city of Jerusalem, on the west side of the Temple Mount, opposite the what's called the Wailing Wall, which we'll talk about in great detail later, they have uncovered a Roman theater that was built by Herod, apparently very small, but a small Roman open-air amphitheater type theater there, and apparently some of the steps were never finished. So whenever they started it, they didn't get around to finishing it for whatever reason. But Herod built all over. And he built the temple because he told the Jews, he said, you know, this temple that Zerubbabel built, you know, it's kind of shabby. Now, during the time between the Testaments, after the Jews threw off the Seleucid dynasty and the pollution of the temple that had happened under Antiochus III, they threw them off. The Hasmonean dynasty apparently had enlarged the courts of the temple that Zerubbabel had built, the second temple. They had enlarged the courts, but they'd pretty much left the sanctuary, the holy place, the most holy place, alone. And apparently it was in a kind of a rundown condition, and it just wasn't good enough for Herod to have in his capital city. If he'd built these things all over the world for people, at least in his capital city he could have something that was worthy of him and being king, and that being his capital. You may not know, if you'd attempted to get a ticket to the Olympics in that time and gone to the Olympic Stadium, the Jumbotron, over the bleachers. I said, this Olympiad brought to you by Herod, King of Judea. He was official sponsor of the Olympics. So he spread his name far and wide. And you might say, well, how did he do this? Well, how do governments do things? He taxed his people to death. What's new about that? But sometime along in here, he uttered those words that Ronald Reagan said were the most terrible words in the English language. I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. He came to the Jews and he told them, he said, you know, this temple is just, it's a mess. It looks like some sort of a fortress, and it's not worthy of the city. And what I'm going to do for you, Jews, I know I've been terrible. And I've murdered people, and I've been a terrible, terrible leader. I'm cruel. I'm wicked. I'm going to kill at least 2 of my children. I'm going to kill one son on my deathbed in my palace and dying in Jericho. But I know I'm a terrible person. But this is what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to rebuild this temple for you. Well, you can imagine how the Jews would react to such a thing. And I often thought, through the years, I thought that all Herod did was he took Zerubbabel's temple, at least the sanctuary, the actual temple, the holy place, the most holy place, and of course the storage rooms around the U-shape, around the bottom of it. I thought he just took that building and encased it in a new casing of white marble, and you know, stuck on a little gold here and there and kind of fixed it up where it was really nice on the outside, but that was all he did. I actually had believed that for years. He didn't. What he wanted to do, and what upset the Jews so much, he wanted to take that thing down to bedrock. And so you can imagine they might be a little bit upset about that. So here's what he did. You know, he said, okay, I'll make you a deal. And for 8 years, he stockpiled the things that were needed to build the sanctuary. 8 years. And so the Jews knew, of course, well, he's really serious about this. But of course, they didn't want the worship of God to end in the temple. And so the agreement was that whatever he did, that the sacrifices must continue during the building period. Now, of course, you know, the Jews didn't want any Gentile craftsmen working on the sanctuary. And they just couldn't have that. And so they said, well, if you're going to do this, if you're going to tear it down, you're going to rebuild it, it has to be rebuilt by priests. Well, how many priests knew how to cut rock, carve wood, you know, put gold foil over everything? Not too many. And so Herod imported, Josephus says, or someone says, 10,000 Roman architects, engineers, builders, craftsmen of every type, and taught, and here again, you get different numbers, 1,000 to 1,500 priests through a period of years while stockpiling all that material to build the building, taught at least 1,000 priests to be the ones that actually touched the stones that went into the building of the new sanctuary and everything involved with it. And so 8 years later, they have everything they need. The marble was imported. We'll see later the tile that at least covered the porticos was considered the ultimate in flooring. It was used in palaces. It was beyond, we've all seen pictures in museums of Roman floors that had been uncovered at Pompeii and other places of tile, little tiny tiles stuck together and make a beautiful pattern on the floor. We've seen that, but Herod went above this. He used the type of flooring he used in his own palaces. It was imported too. It was made of multicolored stones, and we'll see some examples that have been recovered. It was the ultimate in cost in flooring. The temple itself, when we look at the details of the sanctuary, the front of the sanctuary behind the porch had a very large door. The wall behind it was covered with gold, and there was a golden vine which symbolized the nation of Israel. There was a golden vine hanging from the ceiling by golden chains, and the clusters of golden grapes on it were as big as a man. And wealthy Jews stuck doodads, baubles, things of gold, silver, precious stones were attached to that vine as offering to adorn this temple. So he did it right. And to do it right, of course, he had to have an immense amount of money and power and taxation paid for it. And so when we look at the stones, in the 1860s, a British surveyor was hired to go to Jerusalem because they needed to upgrade their utilities, water lines, sewer lines, and he surveyed the city of Jerusalem. This is a copy with, you see the red marks around it. This is a copy of Wilson's survey, topographical survey of the city of Jerusalem. Now, you can see, and right in the middle, kind of to the, just a little bit above the halfway inside the red line, the black line, that's the area actually of the temple. And at the very top, this is Mount Moriah, at the very top of Mount Moriah there's bare rock sticking up, and that bare rock is covered today, of course, by the Dome of the Rock, which of course the Muslims control. But anyway, he managed, and of course a lot of it was covered up. How he drew those contour lines that were buried under 100 feet of dirt is interesting. But he surveyed the city. Now the interesting thing is you look on especially on the right side, and the reason the map is like it is angled, is because east is facing to the right, and so it's actually oriented north and south, but the Temple Mount and the area he surveyed was at an angle. You see how fast the lines are, or how close they are together on the right side. That's a very, very steep valley. That's the Kidron Valley. The brook Kidron ran through there, and it's very, very steep. And what do you do when you cross the Kidron going east from Jerusalem? It's right on the edge, because what's across the Kidron Valley? The Mount of Olives, right. And so when we hear Jesus going across and being on the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane, he's crossing that very steep ravine of the Kidron. Now on the left side, it's not as steep. See, the lines are not nearly as close, and they don't go nearly as deep, because that is a Tyropolian, it's a very hard word for me to say, Tyropolian Valley. It's not as deep as the other side, the Kidron. Now down at the bottom, which is almost off the slide, that's the valley of the sons of Hinnom, and the brook there is the Hinnom, and of course that's Gehenna in the New Testament. So we have Mount Moriah sticking out kind of like a peninsula here. Now, to the north, the land goes upward, which becomes very important when we talk about building the temple. The land goes upward, actually, from here into the Judean hills. But it's just a promontory sticking out there, surrounded by three valleys. And so if we're going to enlarge that temple of Zerubbabel, and by the way, Darius made Zerubbabel and the building of the second temple, he made them make the court in front of it 90 feet smaller than it had been in the days of Solomon. Now, of course, after Darius is gone, the Hasmoneans enlarged the court. But if you're going to expand and build a very magnificent building on the top of this very narrow hill, you're going to have to put in some fill. And what we want to look at for the rest of our time tonight is what Herod did to get a platform big enough to build the temple on. If you look on the east side, that southeast corner on the right bottom, eventually that area would be filled to a height of 220 something feet. And then the wall, the retaining wall would go that high. On the other side, it's only 100 and something. Now the west wall is what the Jews, of course, call the Wailing Wall. And you see pictures, they have a plastic wall between the women on one side and the men on the other. And you see these Orthodox Jews trying to stick little pieces of paper in the cracks between the limestone blocks. The western wall is where all of the action is. The eastern wall was the original, and remained to be a ceremonial entrance, but it wasn't much used because the eastern wall, after all, is just basically facing that valley, and it's right on the edge of the city of Jerusalem. But it was used for very important ceremonial occasions, which we'll talk about maybe later, like on the certain ceremonies on the Feast of Tabernacles. So he has to build a platform big enough to hold what he wants to build. And of course, he didn't just want to build a temple. He wanted to build this grand public space, marketplace, bank, meeting place that was the temple courtyards all around the actual temple itself. Let me catch up here. He started, after gathering materials for the 8 years, he started building in the 18th year of his reign, which would be 1920 BC. We don't know which, could be late 19, early 20, not sure. But anyway, it was in the 18th year of his reign. Now, here's the amazing thing. Now, all this time, he's tearing things down to bedrock. Now, you've got to go down to bedrock with the sanctuary, but before you can do anything else, you've got to go down to bedrock all around these valleys to start to lay the retaining walls. But the amazing thing, they say, and it's hard to believe, after training all these priests, in 18 months, they finished the holy place and the most holy place in 18 months. Now we're talking about moving marble blocks, the inner walls of the temple, 5 feet thick at the bottom at least. And we're talking about building that 5 feet thick wall stepwise, of course, for the beams, for the side storage rooms, like in Solomon's temple. But we're talking about building that wall, how many feet high? Well, the holy place was 40 cubits, right? And the temple, and I was asked this question years ago and didn't know the answer, the temple was 2-story. There was a whole story above the holy place. There were 2 stories above the most holy place. And so this thing went up and up and up. Just the inside, 60 cubits. It sat on a platform, and we'll look at dimensions later. But a cubit, as best we can tell, it's either 19 and nearly 20 or just a little bit over 20. So call this royal cubit 20 inches. So when you've got just the holy place, you've got a room that's 40 cubits high. So that's 40 times 20. Yeah, you've got a high place. Now you've got a room on top of that. The whole thing is sitting on approximately a 6-foot base on top of all the other stuff as you go up the mountain. And so you're talking about a huge building. And it had the porch we'll talk about later. But at least in a year and a half, and when we look at the detailed drawing of how they built it, I think I understand why. Because the other number you get is they finished the holy place, the most holy place, so they could go on with the daily sacrifices. And I guess they stood out in the rain and offered the incense offering, and sometime in that year and a half, the holy priest, the high priest, had to go in the most holy place, which didn't have a roof, on the Day of Atonement. But they kept it up until it was finished. But then the other number you will find is 3.5 years. And I assume, and when you look how they built it, they could build the holy place and the most holy place behind it straight up, put a roof over it, you have a complete building, and then you can come back and the other things then could be filled in around it, the storage rooms, the porch across the front. And I think that's why you see the 2 numbers, that they built it in 18 months, but it took 3.5 years, because it took 3.5 years to put those storage rooms 3 stories high around the bottom of it, and to build a huge front porch across the front, which connected to the storage rooms and also gave access into the storage areas above the most holy place and the holy place. So 18 months and 3.5 years, and we'll look more details later. I want you to count, let's count ceiling tiles. I was going to do this and didn't. let's count ceiling tiles. What do we have here? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24, 26. Okay, this room is 26 feet wide. These are 7-foot doors, so we have about a 9-foot ceiling. Okay, imagine in those days, the biggest stone that's been found in the retaining wall, and it's on the western side, is called the Great Stone. It is 44.5 feet. It's 11 feet high. So you've got this, you've got something, this room and half again, and you've got 9 feet and 2 more. Okay, imagine one stone. Now, they never knew, of course, it's buried in the mountain and holding up everything. They never knew how deep it is. With the advent of ground penetrating radar, you know, they're uncovering all these Mayan and Aztec ruins in Mexico and Guatemala and Honduras using it and searching for oil and new things around Stonehenge. They can now look with ground penetrating radar, and it's not square. It's not a rectangle. It's bigger on one end than the other. But it's 44.5 feet long, 11 feet high, and the small end, the thin end, is about 2.5 feet, and 5.9 feet, and the thick end is 8.2 feet. Now, knowing the density of that limestone, which they mined, by the way, north of Jerusalem, which we'll talk about later, it's limestone quarried north, and that's now part of the city of Jerusalem. But knowing the density of that, they can estimate the weight of it. It's 250 to 300 tons. 500,000 pounds to 600,000 pounds. Now, didn't have steel cables. Didn't have hydraulic cranes that could put out legs like this to make them not tip over. And now they're going to put this stone that big at the bottom of a hill. And so the question is, how did they lift stones that big? Now, most of the stones in the retaining wall aren't nearly that big. A good average for most of them, they say, call it around 28 tons, which is, of course, only 56,000 pounds. How did Romans, no diesel engines, no steel cables, how did they get these stones in place? And not only did they put them where they wanted them, each course, this is called ashlar construction. The stones there was no mortar used. Each stone was fitted up against the other, no mortar on the bottom or the sides, and each course, as they went up, they recessed each layer, each course, 1 inch, give or take a few millimeters. 1 inch. Now, why did they do that? Because when you stand at the bottom of a tall edifice and look up, what does the building look like it's going to do? It looks like it's leaning over and going to fall on you. So as they went up, they recessed each stone. Now imagine, they're putting these in place, and they're putting them in place exactly, so each layer is 1 inch further into the mountain than the bottom beneath it. Not only that, they dressed the faces, as you will see, one that's just been uncovered recently. They dressed the faces, and then they recessed a border around them. Now, not only did they recess each course as they went up, the border got smaller. And the only thing I can compare that to, if you know anything about the Parthenon, what did the Greeks do so the Parthenon columns looked like they were straight? They didn't make them straight to overcome the optical illusion. So the Romans overcame the optical illusion, standing at the bottom of this huge retaining wall that was going to fall on you, by recessing each course and making that border get smaller as they went up. Now, I've always told you, on the southeast corner in the Kidron Valley was about 220 feet. On the western side, where the so-called Wailing Wall is, not nearly that deep. But that gives you an idea. Now, the question is, how did they do it? This is a drawing of a Roman quarry. Now, this limestone, like most limestone, it's not igneous rock, of course. It's just calcium carbonate and sand and everything else in the matrix. And it was laid down undoubtedly in the flood, and it was laid down in layers. Now, the way you quarry limestone like this is you take an axe or whatever you got, and first of all, you've got a layer. You smooth off, and you've got a layer here. So you take an axe or something, and you cut a channel on one side, separating it from the stone that's to its right, and then you've already removed what's to its left. Then you cut another channel behind it. So it's open on two sides, front and the side. So you cut the other two sides, you cut a channel in it, and then you take dry wood, pound it into those channels, and you just every day go by and soak the wood. And what happens? Bingo, the wood swells, the limestone cracks, and then you go to stage 2, and that is moving it off, as you see down here, for the masons to work at dressing it. Now, you see how they moved it. Technique used all over the world in ancient times. You get some good strong oak logs or something, and you use them as rollers, and you get some oxen, and you pull it along. And of course, slaves, as they go by, take the back roller and go run and put it in front of the oxen, and you transport these stones from this quarry about a mile to the building site on Mount Moriah. Now, the last thing to look at is over here. This is and we'll see a detail, this is a Roman construction crane. Now, in order to tie a rope around these things so you can lift them to get that log under it to get it started, the first log is most important. You've got to lift it up. They left ears sticking out on each side, and you can see on each side about a foot sticking out. And so a rope, they could go under it and put a rope around it, lift it, and get the logs started under it and get it started moving. And so when you get to the Temple Mount, they didn't raise those stones. It's higher where the quarry is than Mount Moriah. Going up into the Judean, they roll the stones down to the temple site, and then, I assume with a series of cranes, slid them down that hill, one side extremely steep, other side not quite so steep. They slid them down the hill and put them in place with that 1-inch setback on each course. This is a painting someplace that shows one, and you can't see a thing. But how did a Roman crane, well, if you've ever noticed, if you know anything about the construction of medieval cathedrals, they use the same technique. It's a squirrel cage crane. You don't have a diesel engine. You have a large squirrel cage, and instead of a hamster, you have people in it. And so the people walk on the inside of that wheel. You've got an axle, and you've got a crane. You've got a rope coming down, winding around that axle. So you go one direction, you wind the rope up, and you lift it up, and you turn it, and you get it in place. And then they had to then somehow, I assume with a series of these, because of just the length of cable to get down that hill, they probably had them staged. Then you reverse and you walk the other way, and you lower that stone down the hill very carefully, because you're still having to roll it, and you don't want it to get loose from you, and you want to put it exactly where you want it. Here's another slide. This is a castle in France that they're building now. I've been following this for years. They're building a medieval castle in France. It's kind of going to be like a Disneyland thing when it's finished. And but completely everything is authentic. The only things not being made on site, they're cutting stone, they're cutting trees, is the French government wouldn't let them make their own lime for mortar. They had to buy lime, but they're doing. But here is the medieval style crane, and you can see right now they've got the rope is up on top, hanging from something out of sight, and they're lifting it up. And if you want to see more of this, just Google Roman construction cranes, and you can see better pictures of them. All these things are on the internet. But that's how they move those stone with oxen there. They very carefully lowered them into place using this type of cranes. It boggles the mind to think. So that's the terrain problem. Now, size-wise, if we the platform that Herod ended up with, you saw on the earlier map, you know, it's not a perfect rectangle. It's slightly bigger. The north side is about 1,053 feet. That south side then is smaller, and so it tapers from north to south, is about 927 feet. The east side was 1,554, and the west side is the longest side. It's 1,608 feet. So what they did now is they first of all cleared where they wanted the wall at bedrock, and then they would put a layer of stones on the bedrock, and then they would fill it up with fill dirt, tamp it down. Now they got another platform, put in another layer, fill it up. And so they always had a platform at the bottom when they got the stone down there, then to have a crane down there and to put it in place on the course that had already been laid before. So they built it up layer by layer, filling it in with fill dirt, rock, whatever, which they didn't have any big bulldozer and steam shovel to carry that fill dirt either. Think about carrying that by basketful to fill up this huge platform. Roughly 30, 37, 38, some round terms, 40 acres. They're going to level it off. And of course, they're building in as they go up. They're not just building retaining wall, they're building all the entrances, which we'll talk about next week. This is happening as we speak. They're excavating on the western side down further away from the Wailing Wall under Wilson's Arch. This is some of the stonework that's never been exposed since the Romans probably tore down the temple and threw all the walls down and covered up. The road that was at the bottom of the retaining wall is now 40 something feet of that western wall, where the Wailing Wall is buried. There are more of Herod's stonework buried under the what's now ground level on the western wall than is above it. The stuff that's above it, a lot of it, is medieval, Muslim, and whatever. But this is literally, they're working down there. This is in the area where they uncovered the Roman temple, or not Roman temple, Roman theater, the open air theater. They're actually, this is an ongoing project. And you can see here, and if you look on the internet at this, you can see the edge around it. And on a good screen on your computer, you can actually see down at the bottom, it didn't really show. Well, you can tell the recess here a little bit. But this has been buried since probably 70 AD when the walls came tumbling down. And they're working this area. And in this area, they're down to bedrock, and they're finding on this side of the temple, there are all kind of shops, whatever, commercial. You know, get your Wailing, not your Wailing Wall, but get your temple souvenir here. I'm going to make you such a deal. You know, step right this way, all you pilgrims, and get your souvenir of Pentecost here. All kind of shops. Also on this side, they're digging down to bedrock. Lots of ritual baths, because what did the Jews do? They had to go through the ritual bath before they entered the temple, lest they would be defiled and defile the holy place. But this has just been uncovered in the last year, whatever.